Welcome back to TTC. We bought Milwaukee's new 2833 6.5-inch circular saw around a month and a half ago as soon as it came out, and have been using it and figuring out a way to test it ever since, especially since our M12 stubby impacts haven't been shipping yet. But you see, this new guy, if you read the hype and watch the pipeline demos, it's supposed to be the new top 6.5-inch saw on the market. Supposed to cut the fastest, be the most powerful, so much so that it should beat your typical 7.25-inch saws to boot. Not in cut depth unless they invented a fourth dimension, but you get my meaning. Performance. All in a smaller, more compact than ever frame that should also, people are saying, 6.5-inch saws last longer on a charge than 7.25-inch saws, so tops everywhere. So let's find out. And for $229 bare, we're hoping it is, when the rest of today's entries are going to be well under that. And that's going to include two 6.5-inch saws to go up against it, the RIDGID and the DeWALT. And we also have on hand this here Bosch 7.25-inch saw that, spoiler alert, is going to perform very typical of an average 7.25-inch saw across everything we've tested in the past. So can this new red guy compare to or even beat a much larger and heavier tool? Which of course involves strapping these to our circ saw dyno to test speed at typical cutting loads, peak power, runtime on a battery, which none of these are going to advertise and can vary wildly between brands, and some interesting quirks about heat along the way. So let's jump in. In order of price today, we have this, the RIDGID R8656. This can be often found in the $115 range bare, which is how we'll be ranking these today because many 6.5ers aren't sold in kits. This one, however, is commonly sold in kits, sometimes for even less when it comes to sales. But yeah, this includes their 4 amp hour max output and charger and is part of RIDGID's subcompact line, which is often very good. And in this tool's case, earns the name, I think. Compact for sure. The battery placement in particular seems like a form factor win over the Milwaukee, just sort of out of the way, and its motor is also smaller, making for a lighter tool. 6.95 pounds, which does feel noticeably light with its magnesium guard and skid, which depending on how outstretched your arms are when using it is very welcome compared to the typical sort of M18 6.5-inch saw with an XC pack coming in at 7.9 pounds, which will start it out with a deficit here in the points. So let's see some points added to their score now with some cutting speed and peak power from the RIDGID, which probably sounds a lot easier than it actually is. Dyno testing saws is very tricky already, and we've been testing blade right ones in the past. 6.5-inch saws, blade left in general, all spin counterclockwise, which meant being able to dyno test motors spinning in the opposite direction, which took some work to make sure we could get comparable data between the two. And then there's these silly arbor threads. Every tool loves to be different. M8 thread, M7 threads, M6 threads, standard and left-hand threads. The M18 here, even 5/16 threads for some reason. This took us over a month to get properly sorted and spitting out good data, which looks like this. Using the included battery, the RIDGID, under a sort of typical 2x4 cutting type load, sees 3,900 RPM, which doesn't seem like a whole lot, but this is also the first 6.5 we tested, so have no idea. When you turn the screws to it, up and up, higher and higher amounts of load on the saw for it to overcome until it can't any longer, just like pushing it harder and harder through wood. The RIDGID tops out at 520 watts. Now we also in this series test the next step up in battery offerings from the brand. For 6.5-inch saws, like drills, we're not going to include massive 3-row 9 amp hour, 12 amp hour, 15 amp hour batteries, which weigh more than the tool does. But for the RIDGID, that next level of performance in batteries comes in the form of their 8 amp hour with 21700 cells. They also have a 6 amp hour battery with standard 18650s, but that's more for runtime, though for reference, if you do have one of those, we did get 4,100 RPM and 570 watts out of that. Pretty nice. But with the 21700 cell pack slid in, the saw is now getting a bit of an upgrade to 4,320 RPM, a bit more blade speed bonus from that change here. It's also going to tackle thicker material at a faster rate and the odd tough knot here or there much quicker as well, as it easily passes the 520 and 570 marks of the last two packs and is able to make it just through these 600s here as well, topping out at 700 watts. That's very good for this size of tool. We feel the 7.25-inch RIDGID makes 830 watts just as an example. We're happy to be able to factor both battery types in your theoretical purchase here and score this tool in speed and in peak power with an average of the two battery types of results, making for 4,110 RPM or 41.1 points here and 610 watts of peak power over the two batteries for 305 points averaged here. Next up is DeWalt's current 6.5 inch, which we paid $149 for. A little bit more expensive, a little bit larger, well, noticeably larger even than the M18, though I think a lot of that has to do with the shoe being shaved down on that new M18, which none of us agree on liking. It's sort of clumsy at times, but they both have a similar battery hanging off the end sort of design. It comes in at 7.3 pounds with a standard kit type battery attached, which also puts it in between the M18 and RIDGID. Let's see how it does. When cutting through some wood, the DeWalt is going to be turning things a little bit faster with about 4,300 RPM here. When pressed, the heavier, larger DeWalt isn't going to be able to surpass the RIDGID. 470 watts here to the 520 of the orange tool. But that's where the power stack should come into play, at least until RIDGID tabless packs are out on the shelf for us to buy. The 5 amp hour power stack from DeWalt here is going to perform similarly to their 6 amp hour XR, but in this case stacking 20 watts on top of that. So representing that next level best option from the yellow brand here with 660 watts, which is, yeah, that's still not enough to surpass the RIDGID, which from everything we can tell, besides maybe cutting speed, even including cut depth here compared to a standard more old school 6.5 inch saw, the RIDGID getting more points for that as well with a deeper cut at 90 degrees, but matching at 45 degrees seems like a better buy even if it were the same price, which it is actually a cheaper tool to boot. But obviously our mission's not done here today. How does the new 2833 compete against these and against a typical 7.25 inch saw? Let's find out. To really see if it's that next gen in saws, we're going to include the Bosch Profactor setup here as well, which in its kit form is seeing 4,830 RPM during that same sort of task we've been using to gauge cutting speed, the highest so far. The new M18 makes 5,720. That is quick, but also it is on a smaller blade, less teeth of the same size. So assuming less cutting, let's do some RPM to angular velocity math to find the effective edge speed, or how fast each one of those teeth is moving through wood. The Bosch's teeth are moving at 104 miles per hour at the edge of its blade through wood. The M18s with the smaller diameter, but 5,720 RPM, 110 or about 111 miles per hour, that is a faster cut, and that's not even to mention yet that the Profactor comes with a Profactor battery, which is 8 amp hours. This is only the standard 5 amp hour battery you'd find in most 6.5 inch saw kits so far. Let's kick things up a level, which has got to be the 6 amp hour forge. Yeah, with the forge attached, the starting free speed RPM doesn't even drop under this type of load. We're reporting 6,010 RPM under load, 10 RPM higher than the box says its free speed is. We're up to 116 miles per hour now from the teeth on the blade's perspective. Let's see what it takes to make it stumble. The Bosch 7.25 inch saw makes it up to about matching a median result among every saw we've tested to date, 820 watts. Not bad. The smaller red tool, that's going to make it to just 580 watts. Not a ton more than the RIDGID, I have to say. That's with the standard pack, but it sort of makes sense why they've been showing this tool in comparisons using the forge battery though, because let me tell you, it has to have been designed alongside it knowing it would be out for this one's release, and it aims to prove that, hardly dropping down in RPM as we load more and more onto this tool, all the way up to the 800s, through the 800s, into the 900s, 930 watts. Damn, just wow. I think we're ready to answer some questions here. Is the new M18 the most powerful 6.5 inch saw, and can it keep up with 7.25 inch saws? Well, we haven't bought enough 6.5ers, clearly, but it might be a safe assumption there to say likely yes. And for the larger guys, well, this is where the Bosch is going to place here, 637.4 points total, pretty well. It's also very quiet, which we'll be touching on for the others in a bit. The 6.5 inch M18 is going to effectively beat this in power and speed. It's going to beat the Hercules as well, the full-size RIDGID, heck, even the DeWalt Power Detect and Hilti Neuron in both speed and power up here as well. So it's not really our opinion, no other way to look at these figures. It just seems like it does place in this realm. Let's take a look at runtime though, then we'll rank these and let you know what our overall thoughts are. We take the same size battery, 8 amp hours in this case, simply because every brand tends to have one, and we're able to compare it to our 7¼ inch saws this way. We see how much trigger time under load you have before the battery is dead, how much cutting that is in revolutions, and how much of a drop in performance you'll see. Right away, once under 90% battery, so the RIDGID does sort of step down in cutting speed, and you can hear when that happens as well. It will ultimately cut out first here with an equivalent battery with the DeWALT, both a bit higher speed and longer runtime for 16 minutes total. The larger Bosch with, again, same battery size, doing the same thing, but even more so that the DeWALT did, quite efficient all said, 17 minutes. Now, the Milwaukee, it's a weird one in both positive and negative ways. Every other saw drops off gradually in speed as the battery drains. The M18, not so much. It stays at 6,000 RPM, but for the most part, that increases as the battery is more and more depleted, much higher than the rest of either saw blade size here. And this sort of demanding task has two side effects. One, a shorter total trigger time, 13.5 minutes, which is on the low side for any saw so far. But look at the total revolutions, 80,000. It's going to get a lot of cutting done, assuming you're pushing it through the wood fast enough to take advantage of that. Otherwise, just total running time, yeah, it's going to be noticeably less. Okay, and number two, as far as disadvantages go, this type of demand on the battery, full performance until dead, increases temps quite a bit. It's, for example, drawing more amps at 15% capacity than any other tool here, making for more heat. This Forge battery, well equipped for that and doesn't seem to mind all that much, and also not super hot. But when it's more capacity and different cell type, well, the high output 8 amp hour battery is going to turn off from heat protection before being drained. A 6 amp hour high output would complete this test just due to being less capacity, but also got quite hot. It's likely not a big factor for you. Few people are using this like a table saw, just full on. They're getting stopped and started a lot, but interesting to see something we've not seen before happen on saws. So this data here is 8 amp hours worth of Forge battery as far as the data looks, which would be a lot easier if our 8 amp hour Forge order was being shipped yet. So let's total some things. We also afford some points here for how noisy a saw is, more like simply penalized saws that are close in loudness to a corded one. Not a ton of points to be gained, but the RIDGID was the noisiest and also least enjoyable pitch to my ears, and the DeWALT was the quietest at 91.5 decibels from 1 meter. If you take all these points, the good and the bad totaled, and compare that to the bare tool price, since we're scoring sort of with either battery type here, that's a full 98.5 points for the RIDGID, which is a lot, probably deservedly so at this price point. 74.4 points for the DeWALT, and just 60 flat for the M18, even at this performance level. Maybe being a new tool, little price erosion to happen as it settles in yet, but yeah, either way, 229 bucks, that's gonna be pricey. This all totals to 551.6, 517.8, and 609.2, placing the new Milwaukee in first, followed by the RIDGID and DeWALT. Which makes sense to me. From what we can tell, it's one of the few or only 6.5 inch saws that, save for cut depth obviously, can be pushed not only as fast and as hard as your average 7¼ inch, but oftentimes more so. There's a noticeable gap between a regular 5 amp hour and a high performance battery like the Forge here, 590 watts up to, dang, 930. So it likes these spicier, more capable batteries. For example, in case you have one, the also often good XE 6.0 high output makes 770 watts on this tool. So from a price perspective, between the bare tool price and the batteries it was clearly designed around, well, yeah, it is 7.9 pounds compared to the average 10.5 pounds of the larger size 7¼ we tested, but it will also cost at least as much as one of those or more as well. So you do pay a bit for the technology. For less weight and a lot less coin, especially as a kit, the RIDGID we think is also very attractive and packages things much more efficiently and convenient, I think. We make episodes every Friday. If you'd like to see those sometimes, click some buttons below. If you don't, I'm not sure what you're doing at the end of this video, but thanks for watching.